All right, crim 5. Let's knock out chapter 10. Okay, so let me back up again. Community-oriented policing is what this chapter is about. And I'm going to tell you that the PowerPoint presentation is longer than the chapter in the book. So I'm going to skim through certain parts of it. I encourage you to pause the video, take notes as you see appropriate. I'm not going to read the PowerPoint slides to you because I know you can do that. So anyways, we are aware that the police and the public definitely need to work together in order for either side to have success. Police, as we've talked about quite a few different times in this class, there are so many different little communities inside our huge community of Fresno, for example. There's a community in the Tower District. There is the African American community. There is the Southeast Asian community. There is the white community. There is a Hispanic community. There is the gay community. There is a straight community. So what I'm trying to say is there's so many different types of people who live throughout our community, and it's really important for the police to do their best to try and relate to each of those. And again, we've talked about this before. So we're going to talk about kind of back in history, how the whole concept of policing started. So early on, there was typically the head of the family would be responsible for anyone in that family over the age of 12. So anything that they did, it was kind of the family's responsibility to take care of that. Then we come into the tithing phase, where there was a group of 10 families. They were all responsible for each other, so they kind of joined into their own little community. 10 tithings constituted 100. Ultimately, what this slide is trying to show you is the beginning of the concept of a sheriff. So the shire reeves, and there were groups of families that were bound together, and they were responsible for policing themselves. Again, we're talking more, obviously a little bit later in time, where all men 15 to 60 were required to assist in keeping the peace. So everybody in the community was responsible for their own part in participating in keeping the peace. Then Sir Robert Peel came about. So we'll talk about the Peelian model, and most of you have heard of Sir Robert Peel in the past, but he was elected to the Parliament at age 21, and he established the Royal Irish Constabulary Metropolitan Police Act. So Sir Robert Peel was the first one to kind of get people together and have them work together in being responsible for the community, for the safety, for the peace, for the stability in the community. And they were called bobbies, actually, because Robert, short for Robert, is the name Bobby. So he basically started the first real police force, and that was, what did we say, 1829. So it got to the point where crime was completely out of control, and these kind of informal type of groups were not cutting it anymore, and they needed more, something more harsh, something that had more teeth, something that could actually impose some sanctions, and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, we're just going to skip through all this. Blah, blah, blah. Professional model. Okay, professional model is where we kind of, is the beginning of what we're talking about as to what police are right now. Prior to this, there were times when police were appointed by politicians. So whoever was in political power, whoever the wealthiest person was in that community at that time, they were the ones who decided who all the police were. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of corruption in that because politics and money were the driving factors behind the police, as opposed to fairness, responsibility, equity, and keeping the peace in the community. In the 1960s, as you can imagine, that was around the time, 60s and 70s was Vietnam War. And there were a lot of protests, civil rights movements, pretty much you name it. It was a really chaotic time in society. And getting police to be more professional at that point was the goal. So what they did then, they started doing things like starting more rigorous hiring methods. And I just as an example, my dad was a police officer in the 1970s, and initially he had a hard time getting hired because he was only like 5'7", and he had some vision issues in one of his eyes. I mean, he just wore glasses or contacts, so he wasn't blind or anything. But anyway, so they started to actually look at things like what would make the best police officer. And at that time, of course, they were considering size and physical ability, which is certainly something that's important. But also during that time, citizens started getting more rights. So the Supreme Court was kind of coming down on the police a little bit because the police were doing a lot of shady stuff and they were violating people's rights. I'm going to kind of skip through this. So we're going to talk a little bit about the neighborhood patrols, like we talked about probably several chapters ago. Getting the police officers out there and interacting with the community was supposed to be a positive. And sometimes that works out well and sometimes it doesn't. But they did not find that the foot patrols actually helped significantly in the reduction of crime. And not a necessary part of, what did it say, community-oriented policing. So police and citizens work together in creative ways to help solve contemporary problems related to crime, fear of crime, social and physical disorder, and neighborhood decay. There was something at this time called the broken windows theory. And the broken windows theory was a concept that if neighborhoods and people who lived in the neighborhoods didn't care about their neighborhood, didn't continue with the upkeep of that neighborhood, then the neighborhood itself would be deemed not as important. Let me kind of give a better example of this. I had a case where a young man, a teenage kid, went out to a junkyard, like a pick-apart place. And he went out to the junkyard and he brought his pellet gun with him and he shot out probably 50 car windows at the pick-apart. So in his mind, he looked at the junkyard as a junkyard, a place that nobody cared about because nobody took care of it. So he went there and did not think anything about damaging all the windshields at the junkyard because it was apparent, in his mind at least, that no one cared about it. So consider that story and how that would fit into a neighborhood. If people's front windows are smashed in, if nobody's taking care of their yards, if their cars are parked on the grass, if there's graffiti all over those neighborhoods are more likely to continue to decline because it would appear as if no one cares about them. So this whole concept in community-oriented policing was if we get the community involved in caring more about their community, caring what it looks like, the whole vibe of the neighborhood will improve. And this was good and bad because what happened then is police officers would go out and give people fix-it tickets and things like that and be very nitpicky and write lots of citations and stuff in order to get people to change their neighborhoods. And then the people in the neighborhoods just got mad and thought that the police were just harassing them. So it didn't necessarily work, but the concept was good. Blah, blah, blah. Problem-oriented policing is something else that is really important and something that we, certainly in the Central Valley and Fresno, for example, have focused on a lot. Problem-oriented policing Think Fresno. Where are our main issues? Gangs, vehicle theft, drugs. So the Fresno Police Department has separate units that deal with each of these issues. They have a gang unit, they have a vehicle theft unit, and they have a drug unit. So when we're talking about problem-oriented policing, we're talking about police becoming aware of an issue that is becoming significant, and they go specifically and do some things to address that issue only. So technological advances, of course, crime analysis, computer-aided dispatch, and crime mapping are three things that I just went back and forth with those slides, so sorry, that have changed the way police do some things. I didn't mean to do that. Analyzing crime. The police department gets all their statistics, they analyze crime, and they try and figure out what kinds of crime are becoming more common, how the crime is changing. You think things like internet crime. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there was no such thing because the internet was not really a thing. So crime trends, things like that change. Computer-aided dispatching, this has been around for a long time. So dispatchers obviously dispatch police officers by way of computers. And then you have crime mapping, which is really important. Just think you got a big map on your wall of the city of Fresno, and every time a crime occurs, you get a little red dot pin, and you put the pin in that exact spot where the crime happened. And you will see that there will be groups of areas where you'll see a whole bunch of little red pins together. So you'll know that that is a hot spot. That's a place where a certain type of crime is being committed frequently. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. And again, remember when I talked about the broken windows, and when police officers during the broken windows time were doing this zero tolerance policing and ticketing people for little stuff, and people did not like this. So it was really hard. They were trying to do one thing, and it ended up kind of blowing up in their faces. Citizen involvement. Okay, community-oriented policing, meant to be a problem-solving approach for reducing crime and reducing citizens' fears. Foot patrol, substations. This is another important kind of little area. Instead of everybody who has an issue with the police driving down to the police station on Fresno Street downtown, there should be substations. There should be places where people can go in their neighborhoods to address police issues. And most of you will probably say, oh yeah, there's a substation, you know, a mile from my house, 2 miles from my house, whatever. I know there's one at Manchester Mall, and there are officers there all the time who do walk-ups, so people can walk in and ask them questions. These are really important things. I know there's one in my neighborhood. I don't believe it was open for a while, but I think that the Fresno Police Department has since decided it would be a good idea to be available for the community, so I think they've opened. But this does help the community and the police work together. Citizen volunteers, we do have that in the city of Fresno, so some people can volunteer to be police officers. I'm skipping that. Community action groups. Oh, this is long. Problem-specific techniques. I'm still here. I'm just skipping. Implementation stages for successful change to community policing. Whew. And these are all the steps that need to be taken. Preparation, getting information, contacting the community, reviewing the data. Initiation, beginning to introduce all the concerns that everybody has, public education and training. Then implementation, where should it begin? When should it begin? And who should be involved? Evaluations, is it working? Is it working? And then full implementation after you've done these preliminary evaluations to make any changes that are needed to the community-oriented policing. And it's probably a little bit easier to do community-oriented policing in smaller neighborhoods as opposed to in big cities. But by having the same officers work the same beat or same areas, agencies should be able to make that work. Evaluation, was it effective? After the whole program of community-oriented policing is put into place, you need to evaluate it, analyze the results, and figure out, was this effective? Whew, that was long.